Hello humanoids, Halfling Hannah here from halflinghobbies.com. Thanks for tuning in again to this part 2 of why vampires suck and how to fix them. We already covered why vampires suck and the 4 major reasons why they simply don't do well in a lot of campaigns, and now we're going to cover how we can make them scary again, how we can use vampires in our campaign to create awesome villains that are truly terrifying and not a bunch of super lame ones that are awful. So thanks for coming back. I hope you stick around to the end, and make sure that you like and subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you know anytime that I release new videos. I'm going to be doing a whole series on vampires to fully prepare you to create awesome vampire villains for your campaign, so make sure that you're paying attention for that. So, here we go! Okay, so here is how we can make vampires scary again. First of all, vampires are cunning. They are smart. They are heartless, and they are cruel, completely evil beings. That's it. If you want a truly terrifying vampire villain, then it needs to show how cunning and heartless and evil it is. None of this misunderstood stuff, none of this longing for their long-lost love. No, they are simply evil, evil creatures. And you may think that's a bit one-dimensional, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, the Joker is no less terrifying or interesting because he desires chaos than is any other villain that becomes a villain because of evils done to them. Vampires are evil creatures. Regardless of who they were in life, they are embodiments of death when they're raised as a vampire. And so to make a vampire truly terrifying and scary, your players need to know that there is no hope for this vampire, that they will do anything to those that stand in their way, that no act of cruelty is so far beyond them that they wouldn't do it. That is terrifying. That is a scary monster. Another thing that makes vampires truly terrifying is the fact that they can take different forms. Vampires can actually take 2 different forms. So they have their humanoid form, they have their bat form, but then they also have a gaseous mist form that can squeeze anywhere that air can go, which is really kind of cool. This means that vampires can essentially get into any place, even if it's sealed. As long as air can get through, they can get through. To create a really scary vampire, you need to use all of these things to your advantage. Think about them when you're creating the lair. Are there places that there are no doors, there are no windows, there's simply a gap that only the vampire can get through and your players have to dig their way through or find some other way to get through? Use the bat form. Dracula went spying around in his bat form and nobody paid any attention to it because you wouldn't think about it at the time. So you can have bats, you can have the mist, and you can have your vampire show up and spy in places that your players will not be expecting. That's scary. Not knowing when or where the enemy could show up is scary. Also, vampires can summon beasts. They can summon swarms of bats, rats, and wolves. Again, an awesome way to keep your players on their toes and scared is just to have the vampire summon these things. Not even fight them themselves, but as they get closer, they have to fight through these hordes of rats and bats and wolves before they ever even get to the vampire itself. Another way to make vampires not just more scary, but more real in your Dungeons & Dragons world is to explain the weaknesses within the world itself, which really isn't difficult to do. Again, you'll probably have to tie them to some deity or another. What I would suggest and what I use in my own is whatever god or goddess of your setting controls nature. Vampires are an abomination against nature because it is natural to die. It is unnatural to come back from the dead and to be immortal. All things in nature die. Therefore, the god or goddess of nature is raging and constantly against the undead vampire. This would explain why vampires take damage from sunlight and from running water, very natural things. It would also explain why a stake to the heart would paralyze them. Again, it goes back to that nature, the natural versus the unnatural. That makes sense. So make sure to incorporate those things in your campaign and explain them more so that they're more understandable for your players. Next, make your schemes big. Think really big picture. If you had an eternity to live and you wanted to create as much chaos and death and pain as possible, and you literally could wait thousands of years for your plans to come to fruition, what would you do? Would you set yourself up as the true ruler behind a throne and slowly ingratiate yourself into this noble family and take them under your control? Vampires think about these things. They have lots of time to think about these things. Therefore, you should think of them too, if you really want this villain to be terrifying. Next, you're going to want your villain to make it very clear what happens to those who oppose them. Don't be afraid to go after what your players love the most, whether it's their family or their hometown or their pet. Oh, that's so dark. But a vampire would happily go after the family of anyone who tried to oppose them, turning them into vampire spawn and then sending those spawn to fight the adventurer themselves, so they actually have to end up killing all the people that they love. That's a little heavy. Why don't we stake 5? I'm so sorry. But for your villain to be really terrifying, they need to make it very clear what they're willing to do to those who stand in their way. Finally, to make a really terrifying villain, you need to find ways around your weaknesses as a vampire. Again, think like a vampire would think with all of your cunning. You're chained to the grave. That's one of your weaknesses. You have to return there during the day. Well, there are some ways around that. If you dig up enough earth from wherever it is that you were buried, you can transfer that earth to different places and you can rest there. Therefore, creating multiple resting places and multiple layers and picking one at random. Therefore, your players, if they're trying to figure out where the vampire is during the day, they have a lot of different options and no idea exactly which one the vampire might be at. That is real cunning. That's really terrifying and really frustrating for your players too, as they have to try and figure out where this vampire is. So find ways around those weaknesses. Running water hurts you? Well, get rid of all running water in the city that vampire's in. Have them create dams that are for agricultural purposes, or have them stop up springs and different things like that. Sunlight hurt them? Perpetual darkness in a city or an area. There are spells that can do that. So they set up these perpetual darkness areas, or they live underground with the drow, perhaps. And so they avoid sunlight that way. However it is that you get around it, think of what a vampire would do to avoid weaknesses. There are ways around it if you think about it. And so do not make it easier for your players than it needs to be. A vampire has the time to think about these things and control these things because they're super smart. So think about that too. So, all of that being said, how exactly, step by step, do you create a truly terrifying vampire villain and figure out what the plot of your campaign is going to be? Well, that's the subject for yet another video. So please make sure you like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you know exactly when I release it. Should be coming out in the next few weeks. I've done a super deep dive into vampires, and so I'm making several videos to help out DMs to start using vampires in their campaigns because they're really cool and I think we should start using them more. So, until next time, my friends, may your game have advantage. Get it? Advantage? Yeah, I'm sick of these two. Halfling Hannah here, signing out. I've always wanted to do that. Was it scary? Let me know if it was scary.